I'm Brian Cofrancesco, the head of education here at Connecticut's Old State House, and I'd like to welcome you to our historic courtroom at the Old State House for a program that's part of our ongoing series, Conversations at Noon. As you may know, these monthly conversations usually begin with a peek into Connecticut's history through the eyes of a historian, and then move into a panel discussion that blends history with current insights and issues. Diane Smith, the Connecticut Network's senior producer for program development, moderates the discussions and brings you into the conversation through questions and answers. These programs are generously supported through a grant from Connecticut Humanities. We hope to welcome you back next month for a conversation with retired Supreme Court Justice Peter T. Zarella on Tuesday, March 21st, here at the Old State House at 12 o'clock noon. For now, please join me in welcoming Diane Smith, who will introduce the program and speakers.
And it's really great to have you here, and it's really great to be here because the Old State House was closed for a while because of budget problems, and this is our first conversation at noon since we came back, so this is really great. And of course, most of you probably know this is being recorded for airing on CTN. So let me start with this. Almost 60 years after Connecticut abolished its county governments, there's a push for regionalization. In February 2015, Tom Condon may remember this, the Hartford Current reported, regionalization has been a buzzword around the capital for a generation as lawmakers encourage cities and towns to band together to save money. 2 years later, we may see more incentive to move in that direction as town and city leaders confront a budget proposed by the governor that would cut state aid to many municipalities, forcing them to find ways to save money or forced to cut services. But still, Connecticut is wary of going back to anything that resembles county government. Why is that? Bruce Clouette starts our program with some of the history, and then our panel will look at where we are and what's ahead. So let me first introduce our speaker, Bruce Clouette. He's been active in Connecticut history and historic preservation since 1975. He has a PhD in history from UConn and is a frequent speaker at historical societies, college classes, and other venues, including several times that he's been here with us, which has been great. He recently gave a talk at the Lebanon Historic Society about how really big towns in colonial Connecticut broke up into small towns and what this meant for local identity and government. Please welcome Bruce Clouette.
Thank you, Diane, and thank you all for coming today. I'm going to start with a trick question, so let's see who comes up with the answers. What three things do, and remember we're talking about intermediate levels of government or regional governments, what three things do West Hartford, Hartford, East Hartford, and Manchester have in common? I'll start you off. They're all of those towns are members of the Capital Region Council of Government. Okay, any other thoughts? What do those four towns have in common? Very good. You're kind of a ringer, Tom. I don't know if I should really count that. Yeah, that's exactly right. They were once part of a single town. And of course, they all are and were part of Hartford County, which kind of raises this, an idea that I thought I'd play around with just very briefly. Were the large towns of colonial Connecticut our first regional form of government? If one town embraced what 4, 5, 6 of today's present towns, was that in a sense a form of regional government? Here's what you can say. These early towns of Connecticut were very large geographically. They had a central decision-making, revenue-raising mechanism, the town meeting and selectmen form of government. And they were subdivided into a lower level, a lower tier of government, which were the church societies. Now, up until 1818, the establishment and maintenance of public worship in Connecticut was a government function. So the church societies can be considered, in a sense, a government. And each town had 2, 3, 4, or more church societies, each serving a particular geographical area within that town. Because the minister was paid out of public funds, the taxes for that town were always kept separate by church society, First Society, Second Society, etc. As a result, these church societies obviously had provided public worship. That was, in a sense, a government-funded, if not a government function. They were responsible for maintaining a public school. In many towns, the surveyors of highway, which were the individuals who maintained and directed repairs on roads, there was one for each church society. So in many towns, road repair was on a church society basis. Many towns rotated spots on the Board of Selectmen, although it wasn't called a board, but allocated selectmen, not by any rule or written regulation, but by custom, so that there would be one from this society, one from that society, and a third from another society. Sometimes they would rotate the seats among the various church societies. And finally, militia companies usually corresponded to the church society. So if Lebanon had 3 militia companies, they were for the center of Lebanon, Lebanon Crank, and the area that became Andover. And these church societies eventually, most of them, became separate towns. So in a sense, in the 1600s and the 1700s, there was a sort of overarching level of government that was responsible for things that today embraced, if you went by today's geographic divisions, embraced several towns. Counties started in Connecticut in 1666. Originally, there were 4 counties, New Haven, Hartford, Fairfield, and New London. Up until this point, the various settlement areas of Connecticut had kind of been separate. In the 1660s, it was made one colony. New Haven and Connecticut River were 2 separate colonies. They were merged, and all the other nodes of settlement, like New London, were merged into a single colony. And at that time, it seemed wise to break up the various towns or to embrace the various towns in a higher level of government, which was the county. Windham County was established in 1726, Litchfield in 1751, and Westmoreland County in 1776. Now, who's heard of Westmoreland County, Connecticut? All right. It actually was several hundred miles away from here. It was in Pennsylvania. Connecticut at that time claimed land in the Midwest, Pennsylvania, Ohio, some of it overlapping with New York. And they actually set up a county for some of this land. And it lasted for 12 years. Middlesex, 1785, and Tolland, 1786. What did the counties do? They were judicial. They were to provide civil and criminal courts for a particular geographical area. They had judges, they had sheriffs, they had jails, and they had courthouses. And we might think, oh, well, that's not so much, but consider that, I'm sorry I keep hitting this, I'm going to turn, can you still hear? We all right on the sound? Okay. Consider that government wasn't expected to do very much at that time. So the fact that the counties were given the responsibility for civil and criminal justice, that in fact was a pretty big deal. They had the right to raise their own revenue. The revenue was raised on the town's grand list, but the counties had the power to finance themselves. And I think when we're talking about regionalization, that's one of the key things. The elements are the services that are being offered, the ability to raise revenue, and the responsiveness to local concerns. when I was talking about the church societies within those towns, I mean, those church societies were little democracies of their own. They elected, if it was the militia, they elected their own officers. The church elected its own deacons and selected its minister. So it was responsive. So those three things. What are the functions of the unit? How does the unit raise revenue? And how is the unit responsible? Over time, our Connecticut counties did get some more functions. Licensing, for example, the most important of which was licensing taverns. Counties were made responsible for keeping up the quality of roads, particularly the roads that were serving more than one town. And so if a road fell in disrepair, the county court, the judges of the county court, could order the towns to repair and maintain those roads. In some New England, and also when the turnpikes came along, turnpikes were private companies, but they were supervised by the county courts and eventually disbanded by the county courts. In some New England states, the county jail morphed into the county farm for indigents and the old folks' home for the elderly. That sort of started in Connecticut. Some counties took on the function of widows and orphan funds, but it never really got too far. And I think the reason it didn't get too far is Connecticut was completely divided up into towns, no unincorporated areas like in some of the states. And the towns were established, and the state was an established government, and so things tended to be taken on either at the town level or the state level. For example, most towns did establish their own poor farms, which became old people's homes. The state took on a whole host of functions. I think what's most relevant for our discussion is that the state of Connecticut, and before it, the colony of Connecticut, undertook many things on a regional basis. So in a sense, the state was providing I've got to do something about my hands. What is it? In many ways, the state was providing regional services, if not regional government. First example, probate courts. Probate courts were established established by the state, centered in the large towns, and served the smaller surrounding towns. When one of those surrounding towns got big enough, the state would establish a probate court for that place. But the probate courts were always state agencies and were intended to be locally responsive. The state did a lot of things whereby they provided something for this part of the state, for that part of the state, et cetera. Mental health hospitals and places for the mentally disabled. They were scattered around Connecticut. 4 state teachers' colleges. Highway districts, even today. A lot of the maintenance of state highways is carried out on the district level, which embraces several towns. They're very important. A state police, obviously, the police barracks serve a particular geographic region. State vocational schools. There's another example of a regional service being offered throughout the state by the state itself. However, these functions, state functions, didn't have any particular dedicated revenue streams, and they were not in any way really responsive to the locals. In other words, you have these towns, they're served by a certain barracks of the state police, but that state police barracks is not really in a formal, informal way tied to the approval or pleasure of the towns it serves. So that's not really what I think we expect today of regionalism. Against that, until 1965, the Connecticut legislature was very responsive to the small towns because every town had just one or two state representatives, right? And the classic case is Union had the same number of state representatives as New Haven did. And it was not until the Constitution of 1965 that that went away. So I think that concerns that towns may have had about the state overreaching was balanced by the fact that the state legislature itself was very much a conglomeration of small town interests. I'd like to end up my talk by noting that Connecticut has continually provided regional services by setting up ad hoc entities. It's been very much an ad hoc basis. We have regional school districts with a taxing ability. We have emergency dispatch centers. We have waste districts, and we have health districts. As I get into the present, my expertise as a historian becomes ever more diluted. So I can tell you about the past, but we have other people here who can speak much more eloquently on the present and the future. So with that, I will end my historical overview.
Come and join us. Sit, take whatever seat you like. Thank you for being here. We are going to have this open up to questions. If anybody has a question, raise your hand, and Bill will come to you with the microphone. Because we're recording for CTM, we do need you to speak into the microphone, even if you have a loud voice. So thank you. So joining us now, all the way to my far left, Brendan Sharkey, who many of you will recognize as the former Speaker of the Connecticut House of Representatives. In fact, a lot of people still think you are the Speaker, by the way.
Yeah, I'm recovering.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm a recovering Speaker.
And he served in that position from 2013 until just this past January. His tenure as Speaker capped a 16-year career in the state legislature representing the town of Hampden. During his time in the legislature, Mr. Sharkey focused a lot of attention on the issue of regionalism and the need to create efficiencies in local government to lower the state's reliance on property taxes. He founded the Moore Commission, which served as a forum for stakeholders to develop strategies for promoting regional efficiencies. In the middle seat there is Tom Condon. He writes about urban and regional issues for ctmirror.org, including planning, transportation, land use, development, and historic preservation. And these were among his areas of interest in a 45-year career as a reporter, columnist, and editorial writer at the Hartford Courant. Tom took a one-week retirement and then went to work with CT Mirror. He's won dozens of journalism and civic awards and was elected to the New England Newspaper Hall of Fame in 2016. And to my immediate left is Betsy Gara. She is the executive director of the Connecticut Council of Small Towns, hereafter known as COST, an organization representing approximately 115 towns. Prior to being appointed as COST's executive director, Betsy was a principal in a law firm that she founded, representing a wide range of clients on state legislative and regulatory issues. She also worked as associate counsel for CBIA, which is the state's largest trade and business organization. So, to get us started, Tom, I wanted to start with you and ask you a question, which is, what is regionalism?
A very broad and imprecise term, which has been a problem. Regionalism can be anything from two towns sharing a brush chipper to a city-county merger, right? I mean, and anything in between. So regionalism is a broad term. It's been discussed for decades, more, and not just one. And part of the problem with getting anywhere is that we never define what is it? What are we talking about? Are we talking about everyone all the towns in Greater Hartford contribute to a fund? Is that everybody? We have a single public works department, a single police department. Regionalism is. Needs to be further defined if we're going to get anywhere with it. Having said that, there is more regionalism out there than most people realize, especially in Greater Hartford. The Capital Region Council of Governments regional purchasing, solid waste management. The Nutmeg Network is providing opportunities for broadband-based services, including online permitting, online human resources work. So there is more regionally cooperative activity out there than most people realize. Partly, you know, we still have this, you know, the mythic life of Connecticut is the hearty, self-sustaining Yankee town, and the church on the green, and everybody's independent, autonomous, home rule, right? Home rule would be the real motto of Connecticut. But in fact, we have been, you know, that's been honored in the breach more and more as we've looked for economies of scale.
When Tom and I were going back and forth about the discussion today, he said to me about regionalism, he said it may be similar to what Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart said about pornography.
Yeah.
I can't tell you what it is, but we know it when we see it. So it kind of covers regionalism, apparently. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Former Speaker, how does the Moore Commission define regionalism?
Anything that makes sense, that should be done and can be done on a multi-town basis.
Would you give us a little bit of background on what the Moore Commission has done so far?
Sure. Well, when I was, before I was in senior leadership in the legislature, I chaired the Planning and Development Committee, which is primarily responsible for these issues. And at that time, I asked then Speaker Chris Donovan if he would allow me to form this thing called the Moore Commission. Moore stands for Municipal Opportunities and Regional Efficiencies. And the idea was to pull together stakeholders, whether it be towns, cities, state agencies, as well as labor, small businesses, and anybody who had an interest in how we could go about doing this, to take on particular areas of discussion as to how best to make this all happen in Connecticut. We kind of knew what we wanted to try to achieve, but we found we needed to understand it a little bit better. And what the Moore Commission found over time, and it continued on through from that point when I was chairing a committee through my speakership, was that there were a lot of structural obstacles to allowing towns and boards of education to do a lot of things around the state and combine their resources. Some of it was just inadvertent. Some of it was statutes that would not allow a town to share its backroom operations or its curriculum development or other financial services with other boards of education. Towns not being able to share revenue between and among each other if they chose to do that. So part of it was that, just eliminating a lot of those kinds of obstacles. And then we also realized that there was a lot of structural problems in how to actually measure efficiency. What makes sense to regionalize and what doesn't? And so we began an effort to create what is very boring, but it's called the Uniform Chart of Accounts. And the idea is that every town and every board of education in the state is now connected in their finances, because every single town and every single board of ed was doing their finances differently. And a custodial service in one town would be called something else in another town. And there was no way to measure apples to apples how towns are operating, how efficiently they're operating, or boards of ed. So we created a common chart of accounts. All this stuff's really boring. And my staff used to, when I'd go on to talk about these things, my staff used to be in the back of the room putting a W on their forehead. And the W stood for wonk, because I was getting too wonky with this stuff. But that's the kind of boring stuff that needed to be put in place in order for us to really be able to understand what makes sense to regionalize and what doesn't. And you know, we've got that foundation already in place now, and it's now just a question of taking the next step.
So Betsy, towns and cities were, I don't know if they were shocked because they probably figured it was coming, but they certainly reacted strongly to the governor's proposed budget, which would increase aid for a few towns, but many towns would lose a considerable amount of their town aid. So did all of the mayors and first selectmen get together and say, okay, we can fight this, we're all going to get together and create regionalization for efficiency?
Wasn't their first reaction. Certainly when the governor's proposed budget came out, there was just widespread concern. There are 130 towns that ended up losing education funding and other funding across the board. The biggest issue, I think, is that the governor has proposed shifting the obligation to fund the teachers' pension costs to municipalities. And this is going to increase costs for some towns by millions of dollars. So our towns are now projecting what they're going to need to do to have a mill rate that reflects their budgetary needs. And a lot of them are predicting that they're going to need an increase of between 2 and 6 mills. And that's a huge increase in cost. So I think when I first started working for costs, and certainly regionalism was a big topic, particularly under Speaker Sharkey's leadership, I said, so what is our position on regionalism? And first of all, they said, don't call it that. And secondly, they said, we're already doing it. I said, well, wait a minute, let's talk about this. What do you mean? And I said, well, we're already doing a lot of shared services programs. And I think Tom alluded to that. There is a lot happening. Towns are working with the regional councils of government. They're looking at services such as even animal control facilities, mapping, which are required to do under environmental compliance statutes, things like the online permitting, labor and employment law compliance, a whole host of things that I think towns have recognized work very well to help them achieve cost savings. Where the problem is when they perceive it as a very top-down structure, which is going to force them to regionalize in ways that they don't feel are going to make sense for their community, and are going to somehow impair the delivery of services. And that's, again, where all the problems cause, and people have a lot of concern that they're just not doing the math, that they don't spend the time to consider how a regional proposal is going to impact the cost of the towns and the delivery of services. One example of this is the recent proposal by the Commissioner of Public Health to consolidate the local health districts into 8, and the commissioner used the term county governments, so he certainly waded into this whole discussion on the wrong foot. And as a result, the opposition from towns and cities and from local health director was just monumental. And to fund this consolidation, which was intended to save money and improve the delivery of services, they wanted to impose a 1.5% fee, 1.5% of the town's operating budget to fund this consolidation. So right from there, it was just a non-starter. So I think that's the problem, is that a lot of times there are assumptions that something is going to save money, and unless it's proven, we really shouldn't be forcing towns to regionalize. What we should do is to help them facilitate regionalism where it makes sense for their communities and where there's buy-in from their neighboring communities or other communities in the state, because that's where we've seen some really good results and what we need to focus on now.
Brendan, is it top-down? Is this something that the state is going to demand or is going to put into effect, or is the idea that it should be started at a grassroots level?
Well, if you leave it only to a grassroots perspective and a local perspective, you'll get the kinds of efficiencies that Betsy's talking about, and particularly on the town side. Remember that municipal government in Connecticut is really broken into 2. There's municipal services, and then there's the boards of education, who have a tremendous amount of autonomy under our current system of government. And the uniqueness of our system in Connecticut is that it's the town side of government that levies the tax bill to pay for town government and the Board of Ed. And the Board of Ed, in most towns, are one step removed from the taxpayer. And I think that phenomenon is a reality in most towns. The municipal side of government does run very efficiently, very lean, very mean, because there's always a hue and cry to spend all the money on education. And those who run our education systems have a tendency not to be quite so sensitive about the need to be efficient, because they're not the ones writing the tax bill. And I actually introduced a bill a couple of years ago to allow boards to allow boards of education to separately levy their own tax bills, just to make them a little bit more conscious of the reality of what it costs to raise taxes. Having said all that, if you allow towns and cities to do it on their own, they will do it, and I think Betsy's right. Towns have done it just out of necessity. Boards of ed, not quite so much. But it's not going to get us to really where I think we need to go. And the truth of the matter is that the state of Connecticut subsidizes most towns and boards of education tremendously. And 25% of the state's budget goes to municipal aid of one form or another. The governor pointed this out in his speech the other day, or a couple weeks ago, in introducing his budget. And in an effort to, so if we were to allow towns and cities and boards of ed to do it on their own, they're doing it, but not quickly enough. I would argue that it should not be top-down. It should not be a one-size-fits-all. We should be able to understand what makes sense to reach. Probate courts is the best example. You know, that was a system that was running out of money. There was a crisis, a system that was running out of money that was supposed to be self-funded, and the crisis forced everyone to stop, look at it, consolidate down to about a third of the number of probate courts that we used to have, and it's working pretty well now with the buy-in of all the local communities that participated in that. And I think this is the moment. I think, frankly, we had this moment 3 or 4 years ago. I think Governor Malloy missed the opportunity 4 years ago when we had our first budget deficit. That was the moment to start putting these things into operation. And without getting into too much detail now, you know, I think the state of Connecticut, when so much of its budget is going to fund and subsidize local government, the state should be in a position of saying, look, we will continue to subsidize you, but we're not going to spend state money on inefficient local government. Let's measure, let's figure out what makes sense to do on a regional basis with both boards of ed and with towns. If it makes sense, we'll fund it, and the state will fund it. But if it doesn't, you can still do it. You know, a lot of towns in southern Fairfield County, like Greenwich, don't want to regionalize anything. They want to do their own thing. Well, that's fine, let them do that. But the state shouldn't be subsidizing that inefficiency. And the taxpayers of Connecticut should not be doing that. So I think that's the method. It's not about just forcing it and doing it for the sake of doing it, but rather work with our towns and come up with the systems that make sense to regionalize and then fund it.
How would you get there, though? I mean, a study? I mean, it seems like we're flying blind here.
Yeah. I think what I've suggested to several is that the Moore Commission or some variation of that, whether it's an academic institution or something else, can be the facilitator of the conversation, right? To analyze, using the systems we already have in place, to analyze what makes sense to do and what doesn't. And then tie municipal grants from the state to a measurement scheme to say, this is the way, this is the way we can actually save money on the overall. The other point I would make, and I'm sorry, the other point I would make, and you and I talked about this a couple weeks ago, the crisis that we're facing in the budget right now at the state level, what we've been facing for the last several years, also calls for big thinking. And I think we have to go big. I think we have to seismically change the way we do government, state and local. And the best example I can give for that is that I believe that we should pursue the state taking over special education. The single biggest cost, the most variable and volatile cost for local boards of education and towns is special education. And yet if we regionalized special ed, the Moore Commission studied this. Parents are fully in favor of it because they realize that from town to town, you never know what you're going to get in terms of the quality of the services. If you regionalize it, offered by the state, this is what Bruce was suggesting earlier that the state has done in other ways. The state can supervise it, run it through the regional entities that already exist, and relieve towns of that pressure and the cost. The state should take that on. We can bend that cost curve on special ed and also while still maintaining local review and control over how it's operated. So those are the going big, and then also creating a system
But
for analyzing.
you wouldn't recommend something like city-county mergers, something like really going big?
I think they can do that on their own. They can make those decisions on their own. It makes sense to do that, obviously. And, there are more towns now in Connecticut than there were when we were a colony, as Bruce pointed out earlier in his speech. I mean, we've subdivided and subdivided so many times, and I think we're seeing that with school districts now. School districts are merging in eastern Connecticut because the school population is dropping. The power of the economics are actually already driving the kind of consolidations that I think we're talking about here. But if we're going to go bigger in terms of not forcing it, but figuring it out in a logical way, I think we need to the financial crisis and the political exigency of today is what can drive this thing and really make it happen.
Betsy, how do you think the towns that you represent would react to that proposal?
To merge the towns together?
No, to have the state take over the cost of special education.
I think with regard to special education, something has to be done because it's one of the biggest cost drivers of the education budget, and towns are just really struggling to wrap their arms around what the cost will be this year and the next year and so forth. There's also a lot of pressure on school districts to comply with state and federal laws regarding special education, and I think there's a lot of trepidation about having them make the wrong move so that the legal costs associated with complying with the special education laws end up being pretty significant, just so towns know that they're doing the right thing. So I do think there needs to be something to address that. I mean, right now, towns are reimbursed for special education costs once they hit the 4.5 times the per pupil expenditure threshold. And that just means that some towns are really getting hit hard in terms of special ed costs. So we need to do something to both reduce the cost, make it more predictable, and also provide parents and school children with appropriate avenues to address special ed needs. I mean, it's unfair that some people feel like they have to move their family to another school district just because they feel that they have better special education services. So I do think that that is an area where I think there's some commonality in terms of looking at regional approaches. I do not think that the smaller towns are hard, fast against any kind of regionalism. I think they recognize that in some cases it may achieve some efficiencies of scale that make sense. I was talking earlier with Tom about the regionalization of the public safety answering points, the dispatch centers. And there, initially, COST was very strongly opposed to this because there was some concern about what would the impact be on public safety. But as
for those of us that don't know that terminology, you're talking about 911 services?
Right, the 911 call centers, not the trooper barracks, but the 911 call centers. And Connecticut, I know this is something that the Moore Commission looked at, is one of the few states that really has so many 911 call centers. I think California has maybe 2.
We have 106. Harris County, Texas, which is the same size as Connecticut, actually a little bigger, has 1. They used to have 2, but they consolidated.
California has 10 for the entire state.
California has 10, right? Yeah.
So
And what's preventing us from doing that?
Chiefs of police. Chiefs of police. Chiefs of police. It's a political power
turf
thing for them to have their own special E911 center, and so they've refused. Every year we've introduced bills to merge and consolidate E911 centers, and the largest opposition has come from the chiefs of police, who tell local residents that they're not going to be safe if you allow your call center to regionalize. And they have political clout with the legislative members who represent those towns, and next thing you know, it doesn't happen. So
We have a question right over here, Bill.
So I'm definitely not an expert on regionalization, and the reason I'm here is to start learning about it. One of the things that I have heard in looking into regionalization is that there are other states who do this and who do this really well. Some names that have come up are places like Minnesota and Utah. And it sounds to me like we're kind of trying to reinvent the wheel when there are already good role models of successful regionalization that has accomplished a lot of economic efficiencies. And I'm wondering, to what extent is Connecticut looking to those other states for how to do this so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel? And to what extent can those of us who are trying to learn about regionalization, what are the resources that we can look to learn about this and to bring this information back into our communities?
Who wants to start?
Well, I can give you a little bit. I don't want to dominate this, but yeah, you're right. Minnesota's got great examples, and there are lots of them all over the country. The difference is that they have county government. That's the critical thing. Connecticut's history is unique, as we heard, because every town, we were created with every town having their own autonomy. And we've eschewed the notion of county government here in Connecticut. County governments can tax. They can levy a sales tax, for example, to get that extra penny per purchase to fund a mass transit system that services the entire county. We can't do that. So a lot of the examples of great things that make perfect sense in every other town is a function of our history. And we're stuck with that. And then the politics that comes with that as well.
Yeah, I mean, also, of all the innovations in Connecticut in the 19th century, we didn't allow annexation. And annexation in much of the country has created regional cities, metros, metro governments. There was also a phase about 1970 where there were a lot of city-county mergers, a fair in Indianapolis, Jacksonville, Nashville, Kansas City, and these created large metro governments that Connecticut state law doesn't allow annexation. So, Boston was able to annex its contiguous suburbs years ago, and you could look at Connecticut as Massachusetts without Boston. I mean, just meet a series of small towns and mid-sized cities.
And I bet Luke Bronin, the mayor of Hartford, would like to be able to do that. He's been on his I don't know, not a listening tour so much as a talking tour, going to towns surrounding Hartford and asking for some kind of help to keep the city afloat. And Tommy hasn't gotten such a positive reaction, I don't think.
Well, he's gotten a mixed reaction. I was at one of them. There were, there are people who, kind of embrace the idea that Hartford's over there and it caused its own problems, and it can stew in its own juice and solve its own problems. That point he was trying to make is, look, 100,000 people from the suburbs commute into the city every day to work. It is the core of government, medicine, higher education, arts and entertainment in the region. If Hartford goes down the tube, it's going to hurt the surrounding towns. I don't think you can argue against that. I mean, it is a fact. I mean, the only thing it will solve will be the parking problem. But but again, being in separate jurisdictions, unlike many of the rest of the country, it makes it hard to move ahead. I mean, a big city a big city functions and is vital because people meet one another, talk to one another, come to groups like this, and it's harder to do that. You can do it. I mean, the best we can do, probably realistically, is have regions that work like cities, but it's kind of hard to get there. Anyway, I see Jean's got.
Oh, we have a question over here. Over here.
I resist the generalization that we're stuck with our history. We make history all the time. We made the history pretty much at the beginning of Connecticut, when it became Connecticut as opposed to two colonies. We created counties then, and for reasons that we really haven't discussed, we allowed counties to fall into abeyance instead of expanding them and their functions as a good medium between local and larger, more efficient units. We let them, instead of assigning more functions to them, we let them die, which raises the question why it's not possible for us to indeed learn from other jurisdictions, other states, and perhaps recreate them. But the particular question I wanted to ask is, what is the relevance of education to all of this, and particularly to the seeming impossibility of regionalizing? I noticed that CROG has been mentioned in this area, but not CREC. the Capital Region Education Council. I also noticed that the Chef O'Neill decision, which is pretty clearly driven a lot of regionalization, has not been mentioned, nor has the CJEF lawsuit been mentioned. And the very fact that what regionalization that has occurred, particularly in the third rail area of education, has been driven by the courts, seems to me a pretty good reason for the political arms of government to seize this and do something proactively, as opposed to waiting for the courts to order Connecticut to regionalize, which has been the case in education. I wonder if people have comments about that.
Betsy?
Well, there's a lot in that question, so I'm not sure where you want to respond to. I mean, when the issue of county government comes up, I think people have a lot of concern that all it's going to do is add another expensive layer of bureaucracy on top of an existing bureaucracy. We're a small state. We don't necessarily need a county government to perform those functions. We have focused on, in Connecticut, the regional councils of government, and they have been very strong partners in working together based on collaboration and consensus to identify areas where we can regionalize and share services and explore opportunities to really meet the needs of that particular region. I don't know that you necessarily want, I know as a property taxpayer or a taxpayer, I don't necessarily want to have to pay taxes to yet another entity and question what on earth I'm getting back for that dollar. And so I think there's a real concern. What value do you think county governments would provide? What have they provided historically?
Yep. Yeah, Tom,
Well,
what about
began it with county government.
Yeah. But he mentioned how lawsuits have been driving what's happening, or at least what may happen in education, including the CJEF recent decision. Tom?
Well, I mean, the CJEF decision, if it's upheld by the state Supreme Court, will radically change school funding in the state, and it will be a challenge to do so, which could be an incentive for more regional education services. But I agree with Brendan. I think I mean, we have. The Chef O'Neill has broken down, to some degree, the wall around Hartford. Kids are going out, kids are coming in, thousands of kids have been exposed to better schools. I mean, you can't argue with that. It's been a good thing. It's been expensive, but it's been a good thing. I think the next state takeover of special ed would be just an inspired first step, next step to keep getting, keep getting the quality of education for more kids higher.
I also think it's important, it's been touched on, there are the councils of government that we have that we have consolidated, shrunk from 15 down to 9, hopefully 8 to come. Originally, they were created in the 50s to handle federal transportation dollars, but now they really are these, we've made them into councils of government, which means that CEOs of every town, member town, runs the organization. We've also created a separate funding source just 2 years ago in the dreaded last tax increase that we did. Included in that budget was a dedication of a certain portion of our sales tax to fund councils of government and their education equivalent, known as the RESCs, Regional Education Service Centers, of which we have 5 in Connecticut. CREC is 1. CREC is by far the most aggressive and expansive Regional Education Service Center, or RESC, in the state. But the other 4 are also doing exactly what Betsy's describing. They also have a dedicated revenue stream that they are not tapping right now, that they should be. And the state, we can get into that. But the purpose, I think what we should be doing is expanding the scope of the COGS and the RESCs, giving them more power, more ability, more funding to staff up and create the kinds of opportunities, whether it's taking on special ed on a regional basis through the state, or any other things like curriculum development and other costs that are done district by district by district. Should all be done through the RESC as far as I'm concerned, and we should create the system for that.
Is there a concern that within the COGS that the bigger towns have more power, the cities have more control, and the smaller towns don't have as big a voice?
At this point, with the exception of CROG, I believe, the COGS typically don't rely on weighted voting, so each town has the same vote. There was a movement to try to introduce weighted or proportional voting into the COGS, and we did oppose that. We are concerned that that would allow cities to dominate the discussions and drive policies and leave small towns out in the cold. Fortunately, the Office of Policy and Management recently reviewed that and determined that, in fact, that the COGS are working very well as is, and that they should not be forced to move to proportional voting.
Do we have other questions? Tori, you're right over here.
Yeah, hi, I do have a question. I don't know which one of you wants to address it, so you can fight over it if you'd like. You mentioned early something about the consolidation of public health departments, and as a public health physician, I find it odd that there would be such resistance. Infectious disease and environmental hazards don't recognize town borders. Things like lead abatement, asbestos abatement in schools and housing, et cetera, is something that should be looked at a larger scale, not on a town-by-town basis, because you end up working at cross purposes. If you have your kids vaccinated, but the next town over doesn't have their kids vaccinated, and you're going to the same daycare center, then you're not protecting anybody. So I'd like somebody to answer that.
Well,
Thank you.
Look at this in the context also of the call centers, the 911 call centers, the local political power that residents have to control these things. I mean, there was an effort in along the shoreline to not only where there was a multi-town health district, to split them out and to go back to individual towns with their health districts. I mean, it's mind-boggling, and it's all about this perception of home rule, and we want to have our own thing because we don't want to work with the town next door. And you're right, with health districts, it's like probate courts, right? Well, I mean, the services are the same, and the problem is that the quality of the services, district by district, varies, which was the other driver for the probate court consolidation. You couldn't always tell whether you were going to get the best services by having them broken up as much as they were, having them regionalized. Also, with that, we imposed a lot of new standards for hours of operation and quality. So I think that's also a no-brainer, and a crisis needs to happen to kind of make that happen.
The problem with the proposal was not just that it was regionalizing. The problem is that there are a number of regional health districts, and this proposal just change everything, regardless of whether you're already participating in a regional health district, and make you participate in 8 different county health districts across the state, which didn't seem to make a lot of sense. And the commissioner indicated that what they were trying to do was address some of the disparities in health outcomes. And we said, if that's the issue, if it's the disparities in health outcomes in the cities, let's talk about that. But to just come out with a proposal and say regionalizing in 8 county health districts is going to solve everything didn't make any sense to anybody. And it also, quite honestly, the biggest problem was the cost, the price tag. 1.5% of a town's operating budget, in some cases, was increasing health costs by tenfold. And for what were they getting for that?
And that's a classic example of the top-down approach,
Exactly.
which is the wrong way to do it. Like the probate courts, there was a consensus group that was pulled together to come up with what the plan should be, and everybody bought into it. But when one state department decides this is the way it's going to be, and all of you just have to conform, that's never going to work.
Also, there was the money factor. There was a study 2 years ago by the New England Public Policy Center, which is connected to the Boston Fed, that concluded that if Connecticut merged health districts, PSAPs, 911 call centers, and pension fund management, it could save $10 million. I think it was $10 million over 3 years or something, but don't hold me to that, but millions of dollars. So there is potential. I would like to see a broader study of different services.
That's what we need.
I mean, it would really be. I mean,
that's what we need.
You suggested this before. Bring in the RAND Corporation or somebody who does this for a living. compare what it costs to live in Greater Hartford or Greater New Haven to what it costs in a metropolitan city, in Jacksonville or in Indianapolis or whatever. And I think people would be shocked. And if this is a high-cost state, this may be an area where we can lower it.
Tom, how do we compare with other New England states? Are other New England states doing more of this than we are?
Yeah, that's a good question. That is a very good question. I mean, they're all radically different. But Massachusetts doesn't seem to have the budget problems. Massachusetts has some poor cities, but it doesn't seem to have the budget problems Connecticut does. I don't know why that is, but it is. Rhode Island had a bad budget period, has come out of it with pretty tough leadership. And my brother is in the Vermont state legislature, and that's a whole other world.
That's the Republic of Vermont. I thought I saw another hand up for another question over here. Anybody have a question they wanted to ask? Right here, Bill.
Well, certainly the point that Mayor Bronin is making, and also I think the governor has made, is that you can't have strong regions without strong urban cores. And I know Mayor Bronin has pointed out to Massachusetts is flourishing right now in part because they've invested heavily in Boston. To what extent is that argument resonating in smaller towns and in the legislature at this point?
We've certainly had some interesting conversations about that issue. Other people point to, well, are Worcester and Springfield in the same position as Boston? Probably not. But there is some discussion that, yes, we need to work together to solve the issues in our urban cities, but how do you do that? Does that mean diverting more resources from our small towns to our cities without any assurances that the money is going to be spent more efficiently? I don't think so. And I think there's a lot of concern that property tax levels in our small towns are really getting to a tipping point. And are you creating a situation where now you're going to have a lot of your middle-class homeowners just saying, you know what, I can't afford to retire here. I'm going to start looking to take my retirement dollars out of state. And I think that's a concern. So we're willing to be part of the conversation, but I do get nervous about when these conversations happen during the pressure of the legislative session. It makes it really difficult because you're reacting to public hearings and press conferences, and there's really no time to really sit there and have a thorough discussion to determine how something is going to really impact not only the cities, but also the smaller communities. And I do appreciate that Speaker Sharkey had initiated the Moore Commission because it did provide a mechanism to have more robust conversations about some of these issues. And now that he has left the legislature, unfortunately, that has diminished, so there hasn't been a lot of discussion about that.
Tom, we've heard so much about how millennials want to live in cities and how, cities could attract more people and more jobs if they are robust, if they are really revitalized. Yeah. Could we create a city atmosphere by regionalizing in the way that you mentioned Indianapolis? Could you kind of turn this region and other regions in the state into something more like a city?
Well, it would be a lot easier if it were all the same jurisdiction, obviously, or partially the same jurisdiction. I mean, when Indianapolis merged with Marion County in 1970 under Mayor, later Senator Richard Lugar, Republican, they didn't do the schools. It was just going to be too controversial. So over the years, they've chipped away at the schools. I mean, so it would be a lot easier. I mean, on the property tax thing, I mean, in Ted's point, there is no small town with a property tax rate that is in the neighborhood of Hartford's 74.2, right? I mean, or Waterbury's 62, or Bridgeport's 54. I mean, those are just way higher than any spot. I don't know apropos of what, but I mean, that's where the real, I mean, and it's you want to create, a lively core city, and the high property tax rate works against that. It's hard because that's real money for a small business owner, and so, it is a problem, and regional economies of scale is one way to approach it.
I go back to in the 90s. I was the chief administrative officer for my town, Hamden. I was the mayor's number one assistant. And I can still remember in the 90s the fear and trepidation that we in Hamden felt towards doing things cooperatively with New Haven. And because at the time, New Haven was really spiraling financially. And the concern wasn't about, it wasn't a class thing, or it was really about the notion that our tax dollars would go down a rat hole if we were to coordinate with the central city, who doesn't seem to have their financial act together, where there's a lot of waste. There was waste, it was not being run efficiently. And that's really at the core, because now you see in Greater New Haven, all the towns are really cooperating very closely with New Haven on a lot of fronts, because there's confidence that the city is more competently run and it's more financially stable. That's what Luke, I hope, will bring to Hartford, and he's trying to. And I think his speaking tour is exactly the right thing to do, to gain the confidence that the money is not just going to disappear somewhere. That will then get the suburbs, I think, to participate. Transportation is the other thing, a regional transportation system.
And there is some of that already.
Yes.
Yeah. Question?
I want to ask about the rat hole. So from a lot of the examples of regional services, actually the small towns have done a lot of regionalization. All of the regional school districts are in small towns, rural areas. Most of the health districts, most of the public safety has been regionalized in small rural towns, but not in cities. One of the proposals that's come up this year, I think in response to the financial crisis that Hartford is facing, is for the state to have some kind of review of municipal finances, so you have a sense of how that money is being spent. So could you talk about whether that's something that would be a component that would help support people's attitudes about regionalization, and just the general sort of response, particularly from small towns, about state sort of review of municipal finances?
Personally, yeah, I think that would be helpful. I think and Betsy is in a better position, I think, to talk about it than I, but it seems to me that that has value for two reasons. One, it complements what I described earlier, this common chart of accounts, where we can compare apples to apples, how much we're spending for a janitor or for field maintenance or whatever. But also the fear factor and the rat hole factor, for the suburban communities who feel as though they're doing the right thing for their own communities financially, but they're having a hard time, and they need to have some assurance. I think it's a good first step. The other reason why I think it's helpful is when we look at one of the more recent state takeovers of a city, which was in the case of Waterbury in the early 2000s. What you had there was a complete state takeover of the entire operations, and you can argue that there were good things that came from that, but it also was a purging and a real, I think most folks who are sympathetic to local labor issues look back at that period in fact, it turned out that it was that suits that were brought by labor against the administration for the very draconian approach that they took to Waterbury's existing contracts, labor contracts. Those were ultimately overturned later on. The state is now paying off the Rowland administration's heavy-handedness on this. So a state takeover of a city might sound like it's a great idea for some people who are kind of looking at it from afar. Just let the state take it over and clean it up and make it better. It doesn't often lead to good results. So therefore, having that kind of a measurement, sort of like the stress test that we've done with banks now, so that they're not too big to fail, it seems like it's in that same vein, and I think that would be helpful.
And I think the budget secretary and the governor did propose the idea of more supervision of certain cities, and that cities and towns would be ranked based on how financially viable they appear to be, and then OPM could step in and give some assistance, give some help in terms of trying to reorganize things, right, which might be to help fend off having to take over a city. We have time for one more question. Does somebody else have a question? Right here.
Is there, maybe it's the councils of governments, I'm not sure, but is there any kind of regional entity that oversees the wise use of our natural heritage, not just economic efficiencies, but maybe economic planning so that we can preserve a lot of what makes Connecticut a good state to live in. I live in South Windsor, and once the Buckland Mall went in, South Windsor had to fall all over itself to put in Evergreen to get lots of its own tax money out of the spending spree that was going on. And they're right next to one another. And all this beautiful farmland is just falling to one shopping center after another plaza after another, all within neighboring towns. It's all within like 5 miles of one another. It just doesn't seem a very wise use of our resources. Is there anything that already speaks to that?
No, that's, I mean, that is classic poor regional planning. You know, the proposal, regional revenue sharing, which is done in Minneapolis and half dozen other metros around the country, would alleviate some of that. In other words, instead, you know, we end now with all these little towns. They're always fighting over, you know, where ING is going to locate, or, you know, and it's a waste of time. You know, it's, you know, God, when ING was around, God, it was going to go to East Hartford, then it was going to go to the Colt Building, everybody, and then it ends up on Day Hill Road in Windsor with everybody else. And you know, it is a waste of time. You know, a broader organization of government would, somebody once suggested that Connecticut organize itself around its river basins. And that you could do better environmental planning that way, but that was a classic, you know, the Manchester got the mall and South Windsor got the traffic, you know, it was, what a deal. And you know, so it is a glaring need in Connecticut for stronger, more meaningful regional planning, which the reformed councils of government should be able to do. They are stronger now than they were when we had 15 regional planning agencies. I mean, one of them had 4 towns in it. That was, I mean, it's more like a, you know, a lawn party. So, you know, but great example of a glaring weakness.
But there are a number of state laws that seek to protect the state's natural resources and encourage municipalities to protect open space, watershed lands, farmlands, et cetera, historic preservation. And I think those are all very good programs. Unfortunately, a lot of the funding for those programs has been swept to address the budget deficit. There's also the state plan of conservation and development, and each town is required to prepare a local plan of conservation and development. So I would encourage you to work with your community to look at that. I believe ours is having a town meeting on it sometime this week. So it is something that they do have to hold public hearings on. Part of what you're saying, though, from what I understand and talking to local economic development directors, is that it's business practice. If there's a Walgreens that opens up, a CVS opens up down the street, and if there's this type of entity, they know that somebody's done their homework and has figured out that the demographics will support a Kohl's, so let's put in another type of store. So I don't know how you get away from that. I think, more of a focus on some regional economic development planning certainly could help address that kind of sprawl.
We have created what are called regional economic development districts, using a federal model that allows a region to form around a central city, and by doing so, qualify for federal dollars that they would otherwise not be entitled to. Smaller towns would not get federal dollars typically unless they're associated with a central city. So the EDDs are a relatively new phenomenon that have created these plans. We've also, talking about trying to clear away the obstacles to doing this, we have a law on the books, we've had it for 6 or 7 years now, that allow towns to voluntarily agree to share revenue for new economic development projects. So if a region gets together and says, look, we're not all going to compete for the new ING headquarters or the new shopping mall or the new manufacturing plant, so that the individual town where it happened, the lucky jackpot winner who, lands the manufacturing plant's going to get all the tax revenue from that. No, they'll get the lion's share of it. But if we all agree, we'll all get a piece of the new revenue that comes from those property taxes. And that helps to mitigate the kind of competition that occurs. It's happening in northeastern Connecticut. A few towns up there have agreed to do this voluntarily. And sure enough, there was an industrial park that was built in one town, but the surrounding towns are all sharing a piece of the revenue that's come from that industrial park, and they've worked cooperatively. It can work, but people just have to have the will to do it.
I mean, the underlying thing there is, of course, the heavy reliance on the property tax. You know, I mean, it's very hard for a town planner to say no, and to develop some good development or bad development. You know, if it's going to pay taxes, we'll run a strip mall through the park. You know, I mean, so that the heavy reliance on property taxes is something that needs to be dealt with.
And that's the topic of our next conversation, I suspect. I want to thank all three of you for coming. Betsy Gara from COST, Tom Condon from ctmirror.org, and Brendan Sharkey, the former speaker, and I suspect still to be involved in the Moore Commission and in what's happening statewide. Thank you all three for being with us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dave.